Andre adjusted his grip to better support Stanley's weight. English was my best subject, he said, surprising himself with the admission. Before everything. They fell silent again, saving their breath for the task of moving forward. The snow was almost to Andre's knees now in some spots, and his feet had gone completely numb. But he could see the edge of the park ahead, where the street lights of Maple Avenue cast an orange glow through the falling snow. Almost there, Andre encouraged, though he knew they still had several blocks to go after leaving the park, just a little farther. Stanley nodded, but his eyes had taken on a distant look that scared Andre. The old man's steps became more stumbling, less coordinated. Mr. Green, Andre said sharply. Stay with me, okay? Tell me about your house. The one with the blue shutters? Stanley blinked, seeming to come back to himself a bit. It's Victorian, built in 1897. My wife and I... We bought it 40 years ago. Too big for just me now, but couldn't sell it. Too many memories. Your wife? Andre prompted when Stanley fell silent again. He needed to keep the man talking, keep him present. Rose, Stanley said, and his voice softened. She passed 2 years ago. Cancer, quick at the end, thank God. Andre didn't know what to say to that. Death was something he understood too well. But comfort was not a language he'd had much practice with lately. My mom died 3 months ago, he offered instead, the words escaping before he could catch them. That's why I'm... Stanley's cloudy eyes cleared for a moment as he looked at the boy. I'm sorry, son, truly. Those 3 simple words spoken with such genuine feeling hit Andre harder than he expected. He'd heard plenty of sorry for your loss comments at the funeral, but none had carried the weight of shared understanding that Stanley's did. Yeah, Andre managed, swallowing hard. Me too. They had reached the street now. The sidewalks were partially cleared, making walking slightly easier, but the wind was stronger without the trees to block it. Andre could feel Stanley shivering violently against him. Which house? Andre asked, looking down the long street lined with large old homes. End of the block, Stanley said, his words slurring slightly. The one with the porch swing. Andre spotted it. A grand old house set back from the street with a wide front porch and, yes, a swing swaying gently in the wind. It looked impossibly far away. We're going to make it, Andre said, as much to convince himself as Stanley. Just stay with me. But Stanley's steps were becoming more dragging and his weight grew heavier against Andre's side. Something was wrong, more wrong than just a fall in the cold. My chest, Stanley gasped suddenly. Feel tight. Fear shot through Andre. He'd seen enough TV shows to know what that might mean. A heart attack. His mom had worked as a nurse's aide before she got sick, and sometimes she'd talk about the patients she'd helped. Heart trouble was serious business. Just a few more houses, Andre urged, practically dragging Stanley now. We're almost there. The last 50 yards to Stanley's house were the longest of Andre's life. By the time they reached the porch steps, Stanley could barely stand, and Andre was using every ounce of strength he had left to keep the old man upright. Keys? Andre panted. Stanley fumbled in his coat pocket with a shaking hand, eventually producing an old-fashioned key ring. Andre took it and after 3 tries with his frozen fingers managed to unlock the door. The rush of warm air that greeted them was like walking into heaven. Andre helped Stanley inside and kicked the door shut behind them. The house was dimly lit by a single lamp in what looked like a living room, but Andre could still make out high ceilings and wooden floors that creaked under their wet shoes. Couch, Stanley whispered, gesturing toward a large sofa visible through an archway. Andre guided him there, and Stanley collapsed onto it with a groan. In the better light, Andre could see how pale the old man's face was, with a sheen of sweat despite the cold. You need a doctor, Andre said, looking around. Do you have a phone? Stanley pointed weakly to an old-fashioned landline on a small table near the couch. But I don't need... Yes, you do, Andre cut him off. You're having chest pains. That's serious. Stanley looked like he wanted to argue but didn't have the strength. Andre picked up the phone and dialed 911, something he'd never thought he'd do willingly. People on the streets avoided authorities of any kind. Police, ambulances, social workers. They meant questions, and questions meant trouble. One, what's your emergency? A woman's voice answered. I need an ambulance, Andre said, trying to keep his voice steady. An elderly man is having chest pains. He fell in the snow and we had to walk a long way, and now he can't catch his breath and his face is all gray. What's the address? The dispatcher asked. Andre looked at Stanley, who whispered, 724 Maple Street. Andre repeated the address to the dispatcher, who assured him help was on the way. Stay on the line with me until they arrive, she instructed. Okay, Andre agreed. He turned to Stanley, covering the mouthpiece. They're coming. Just hang on, Stanley nodded weakly. Thank you, he whispered. You're a good boy. Those simple words made Andre's throat tighten unexpectedly. It had been so long since anyone had said anything kind to him. Should I do anything for him while we wait? Andre asked the dispatcher. Is he conscious and breathing? She asked. Yes, but he's really pale and sweaty. Keep him comfortable. Don't give him anything to eat or drink. If he has aspirin in the house and isn't allergic, he can chew one. It might help if he's having a heart attack. Andre relayed this to Stanley, who pointed to a kitchen visible through another doorway. Medicine cabinet. Above the sink. Andre hesitated, not wanting to leave the old man alone. I'll be right back, he promised, then hurried to find the aspirin. The kitchen was large and old-fashioned, with worn countertops and appliances that looked like they belonged in a museum. Andre found the cabinet and, standing on tiptoe, located a bottle of aspirin. He filled a small glass with water and hurried back to Stanley. Here, he said, helping the old man sit up slightly to take the pill. The lady says to chew it. Stanley did as instructed, grimacing at the bitter taste. Andre noticed that his hands were ice cold and shaking badly. You should get out of those wet clothes, Andre said, looking around. There was an Afghan thrown over the back of a nearby armchair. He grabbed it and carefully draped it over Stanley. This might help until the ambulance comes. Stanley looked at Andre with clearer eyes now. You're soaking wet too, he observed. There's a linen closet in the hallway. Towels, help yourself. Andre shook his head. I'm fine. You're shivering, Stanley countered. Please. Rose would never forgive me if I let a guest catch pneumonia in our home. Something about the way Stanley said it, so matter-of-fact, as if Andre were just a normal visitor and not some street kid who'd stumbled into his life, made Andre feel a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The ambulance will be here in 5 minutes, the dispatcher's voice said from the phone. Andre had sat down on the coffee table. How is he doing now? Andre picked up the phone again. A little better, I think. His color's not so bad. In the distance, he could hear the wail of sirens growing closer. Help was coming. Stanley would be okay. And then, what? Andre looked around at the warm, comfortable house. Once the ambulance took Stanley away, what was he supposed to do? Go back out into the blizzard? As if reading his mind, Stanley reached out and weakly grasped Andre's wrist. Stay, he said quietly. After they take me. The house will be empty. Stay warm tonight. Andre stared at him in disbelief. You don't even know me. A small smile touched Stanley's pale lips. I know enough. The sirens were very close now, and flashing lights painted the falling snow red and blue outside the windows. Andre felt a surge of panic. Authorities meant questions he couldn't answer. But he couldn't just leave Stanley alone. I'll stay until they come, he promised. Make sure you're okay. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Andre slept in the son's old bedroom, though it took him nearly a week before he could sleep through the night without waking at every creak and groan of the old house. Stanley moved slowly at first, following doctor's orders and taking his new medications religiously. Andre made sure of that, setting up a system with small notes and reminders that Stanley pretended to find annoying but secretly appreciated. They were cautious around each other in those early days, like two people speaking different languages, searching for common words. Stanley would start to ask something, then stop himself, worried about prying too deeply into Andre's past. Andre would offer to help with something, then pull back, not wanting to overstep. But gradually the walls between them thinned. It started with breakfast. Stanley was an early riser, a habit from decades of teaching. The third morning after he'd come home from the hospital, Andre came downstairs to find him struggling to manage a frying pan one-handed while leaning on his cane. Let me do that, Andre said, taking the spatula from him. You're supposed to be resting. Stanley reluctantly sat at the kitchen table. I've been making my own breakfast for 72 years. Hard habit to break. Andre flipped the eggs with more confidence than he felt. Well, consider it broken, at least until the doctor says otherwise. After that, cooking became Andre's domain. He wasn't very good at first. He burned the toast, overcooked the eggs, and once managed to make oatmeal so thick it could have repaired the cracks in the driveway. But he improved quickly, learning from his mistakes and occasionally from the cooking shows he discovered on Stanley's ancient television. It was during one of these meals, about 2 weeks into their arrangement, that Stanley cleared his throat and looked at Andre with an expression the boy had come to recognize as his teacher face. "I've been thinking," Stanley began, setting down his fork. "You should be in school." Andre stiffened. School meant records. Records meant questions about where he lived, who his guardians were, why he hadn't been attending for the past 3 months. "I can't," he said flatly. "You can," Stanley countered, "and you should. You're too smart to waste that brain of yours." Andre pushed his food around on his plate. "It's complicated," Stanley's voice softened. "I know it is, but I was a teacher for 45 years. I have some connections at the local high school. We could figure something out, no questions asked. At least for now." The idea was tempting. Andre had always liked school before everything fell apart. He missed the routine, the learning, even the homework sometimes. "Maybe," he conceded finally. "But not yet." Stanley nodded, knowing better than to push too hard. "Fair enough. In the meantime, though, there's a perfectly good study upstairs full of books. No reason you can't keep learning." That afternoon, Andre found himself in Stanley's study, surrounded by bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. He ran his fingers along the spines: classics, history, science, poetry. So many words, so many ideas, all carefully preserved in this quiet room. He selected a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and settled into the leather chair by the window. By the time Stanley came looking for him hours later, Andre was halfway through the book, completely absorbed. "Dinner's ready," Stanley announced from the doorway. "I made sandwiches. Nothing fancy, but it'll do." Andre looked up, surprised. "You shouldn't be—" "I'm perfectly capable of slapping some ham between 2 pieces of bread," Stanley interrupted with a smile. "Besides, you've been cooking every meal. It's my turn." As they ate their simple dinner, Stanley nodded toward the book Andre had brought downstairs with him. "Good choice. One of my favorites to teach. It's good," Andre agreed. "Different than I expected." "How so?" Andre thought for a moment. "Everyone always talked about it like it's just about racism. But it's about more than that. It's about seeing people for who they really are." Stanley's eyes lit up, and Andre could suddenly picture him in front of a classroom, inspiring students to look deeper, think harder. "Exactly right," Stanley said. "The best books always work on multiple levels." Their conversation about the book stretched long into the evening, jumping from topic to topic: justice, childhood, courage, family. It was the longest conversation they'd had since Andre had arrived, and something shifted between them that night. A door opened, one that would be hard to close again. The next day, Stanley received a phone call that left him quiet and thoughtful. Andre gave him space, retreating to the study with another book, but his curiosity got the better of him eventually. "Everything okay?" he asked when he came down for lunch and found Stanley staring out the kitchen window. "That was my daughter, Elaine," Stanley said, still looking out at the snowy yard. "The hospital called her about my heart attack." Andre tensed. He hadn't considered that Stanley's family might become involved. "What did she say?" "She's coming to visit," Stanley replied, turning to face Andre. "This weekend." The news hit Andre like a physical blow. Of course, Stanley's daughter would come check on him. And when she did, where would that leave Andre? The temporary arrangement that had begun to feel not so temporary suddenly showed its fragile edges. "That's good," Andre managed to say. "She should see how you're doing." Stanley watched him carefully. "You don't have to leave, you know. This changes nothing between us." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Change was coming, ready or not. The next few days passed in a blur of cleaning and preparation. Andre threw himself into making the house perfect for Elaine's arrival, as if proving his worth through swept floors and polished furniture. Stanley tried to tell him it wasn't necessary. "She's not coming to inspect the place," well, but Andre couldn't be stopped. When Saturday morning arrived, Andre was up before dawn, making a breakfast more elaborate than anything he'd attempted before. Pancakes from scratch, bacon, fresh fruit, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of dirty water. Stanley came downstairs in his good sweater, hair combed neatly, looking both excited and nervous. "You've outdone yourself," he said, surveying the breakfast spread. "What time is she coming?" Andre asked, glancing at the clock for the 100th time that morning. "Around 11, Stanley replied. "Her flight gets in at 9. Andre nodded and began planning his escape. He would make himself scarce, maybe go for a long walk while they had their reunion. The last thing Elaine needed was to find some strange kid in her father's house, wearing her dead brother's clothes. But Stanley, as usual, seemed to read his mind. "I'd like you to be here when she arrives," he said quietly. "She should meet the young man who saved my life." Before Andre could argue, the doorbell rang 3 hours early. Both of them froze, looking at each other in surprise. "She must have taken an earlier flight," Stanley said, rising from his chair with the help of his cane. "Coming!" Andre's heart pounded as he heard Stanley open the front door, heard a woman's voice, heard the emotion in their greeting. He stood in the kitchen, trapped, unsure whether to make himself known or slip out the back door. The decision was made for him when Stanley appeared in the kitchen doorway with a woman in her 40s. She had her father's eyes and a cautious smile that faded slightly when she spotted Andre. "Elaine, this is Andre," Stanley said. "The young man I told you about on the phone. Andre, my daughter Elaine." Andre wiped his suddenly sweaty palms on his jeans. "Nice to meet you," he managed. Elaine's expression was unreadable as she looked him up and down. "So you're the one who helped my father?" Andre nodded, unable to find more words. "Then I owe you my thanks," she said, her voice warming slightly. "Dad says you've been taking good care of him." "He exaggerates," Andre mumbled, looking at the floor. "I just help out a little," Stanley laughed. "He's being modest. The house hasn't been this clean in years, and I'd have starved to death without his cooking." A small smile touched Elaine's lips. "Well, something smells delicious. Is that breakfast? I'm starving after that early flight." Just like that, the three of them were sitting at the kitchen table, passing plates and making small talk. Andre said little, watching the dynamics between father and daughter. There was affection there, but also tension, unspoken words hanging in the air between them. After breakfast, Stanley suggested giving Elaine a tour of the house. "Not that anything's changed in the 20 years since you lived here," he added with a wink at Andre. As they moved from room to room, Andre hung back, feeling increasingly like an intruder on a family moment. When they reached the second floor and approached the son's bedroom, now his bedroom, Andre felt his chest tighten with anxiety. Elaine paused outside the door, her hand on the knob. "Do you still keep it like a museum?" she asked her father, something like pain in her voice. Stanley exchanged a glance with Andre. "Not anymore," he said gently. "Andre's been using it." Elaine's eyes widened slightly as she looked between them. Without a word, she opened the door and stepped inside. Andre's few possessions were neatly arranged. The books he'd borrowed from the study, a sketchpad Stanley had given him when he noticed Andre doodling on scrap paper, the clothes he'd been slowly making his own. "You've made some changes," Elaine said, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope that's okay," Andre said quickly. "I can move to another room if—" "No," Elaine interrupted, surprising both of them with the firmness in her voice. "No, it's good. This room needed life again." She turned to her father. Mom would have approved. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken grief and new beginnings filling the space between them. Later, when Stanley went to lie down for his afternoon rest, a habit his doctor had insisted on, Elaine cornered Andre in the kitchen as he cleaned up lunch dishes. "How old are you, really?" she asked without preamble. Andre hesitated, then decided on honesty. 14, she nodded as if confirming a suspicion. "And your parents?" "Mom died 3 months ago," he said, focusing on the plate he was washing. "Dad's not in the picture. So you were on your own when you found my father?" "Yes." Elaine was quiet for so long that Andre finally looked up. To his surprise, there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being here when I wasn't." The kitchen fell silent after Elaine's words, neither she nor Andre quite knowing what to say next. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the old clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the house settling. "What happens now?" Andre finally asked, setting the last dish in the drying rack. Elaine leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That depends. What do you want to happen?" The question caught Andre off guard. No one had asked what he wanted in a very long time. "I don't know," he admitted. I like it here. Stanley, your dad, he's been good to me. But I know this isn't. He struggled to find the words. Isn't normal. I can't stay forever? Why not? Elaine asked, surprising him again. When Andre looked confused, she continued. Dad called me 3 days ago. We talked for over an hour. Longest conversation we've had in years. Know what most of it was about? Andre felt his face grow warm. Me? He told me how you've been taking care of him. How you've given this old house more life than it's had in years. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. And he told me he wants to become your legal guardian. If you'll have him. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Andre gripped the edge of the sink to steady himself. He wants to what? He's already spoken to a lawyer friend of his, Elaine explained. It's complicated, of course. There would be paperwork, court dates, social workers. But it's possible. Andre's mind raced. Living here permanently? Having a real home again? It seemed too good to be true. What about you? He asked cautiously. It's your family. Something softened in Elaine's face. I haven't been much of a daughter these past few years, she admitted. After Mom died, I couldn't handle Dad's grief on top of my own. I ran away in my own way. She looked Andre in the eye. But you ran toward him when he needed someone. That counts for a lot in my book. Before Andre could respond, Stanley appeared in the doorway, moving more steadily with his cane than he had in days. I see you two are getting acquainted, he said, looking between them. Good. Saves me the trouble of convincing you both that this could work. Elaine rolled her eyes. Were you eavesdropping, Dad? I prefer to call it gathering information, Stanley replied with a grin. Old teacher habit. He turned to Andre, his expression growing serious. So, what do you think? I know it's a lot to consider. You might have other plans, Andre almost laughed at that. Plans? 3 weeks ago, his only plan had been to survive until morning. And now here he was being offered something he'd stopped letting himself dream about. A family. I'd like that, he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. I'd like that a lot. The smile that spread across Stanley's face was like sunrise after the longest night. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Elaine extended her weekend visit to 2 weeks, helping navigate the complex legal process of establishing Stanley as Andre's temporary guardian. She used her connections as an attorney to expedite paperwork that normally took months. There were hurdles, of course. Meetings with social workers who asked probing questions about Andre's past and his time on the streets. Medical examinations that revealed he was underweight and had a minor case of untreated asthma. School evaluations to determine where he should be placed after missing half a year of education. Through it all, Stanley was a steady presence, advocating for Andre with the fierce protectiveness of a much younger man. Even Elaine seemed surprised by her father's determination. I've never seen him fight so hard for anything, she told Andre one evening as they washed dishes together. Not even when Mom was sick. I don't want to be a burden, Andre replied, the worry that had been gnawing at him finally finding voice. What if it's too much? His heart has been stronger since you arrived, Elaine finished for him. The doctor said so at his last checkup. Sometimes purpose is the best medicine. By early spring, Andre was enrolled in the local high school. Stanley had called in favors with former colleagues, smoothing the way for Andre's mid-year transfer. His first day, Stanley insisted on driving him, though he was still supposed to limit his activities. You don't have to do this, Andre protested as they pulled up to the school entrance. I can take the bus. Stanley turned off the engine and faced him. I know I don't have to. I want to. As Andre gathered his new backpack, filled with supplies Stanley had insisted on buying, the old man cleared his throat. Just so you know, Stanley said, I'm proud of you. Whatever happens in there today, I'm already proud. Those words carried Andre through the nerve-wracking experience of being the new kid. He'd always been a quick study, and despite his time away from school, he found himself able to keep up in most subjects. Math was hardest, but Stanley's patient tutoring in the evenings helped bridge the gaps. By the time summer arrived, bringing warm breezes that chased away the last memory of that snowy night, life had settled into a new normal. The court had granted Stanley temporary guardianship, with a hearing for permanent placement scheduled for fall. Elaine visited monthly now, her relationship with her father healing a little more with each trip. One particularly warm Saturday in July, Stanley suggested they clean out the attic. Been meaning to do it for years, he explained. No time like the present. The attic was a treasure trove of family history, old photo albums, holiday decorations, toys from Stanley's children's younger days. Andre handled each item with care, listening as Stanley told the stories behind them. In one dusty corner, they discovered a box of notebooks, Stanley's teaching journals from his decades in the classroom. "Look at this," Stanley said, opening one from the early 1980s. Lesson plans, student notes, teaching ideas. Thought these were lost years ago. Andre watched as Stanley flipped through page after page of neat handwriting, his expression both wistful and energized. An idea began to form. "You miss it, don't you?" Andre asked. "Teaching?" Stanley looked up, considering the question. "Parts of it. Not the paperwork or the politics. But helping young people discover ideas, watching them grow into themselves, yes. I miss that very much." 2 weeks later, after several hushed phone conversations with Elaine, Andre presented Stanley with an application to become a volunteer tutor at the community center. 3 afternoons a week, Andre explained as Stanley reviewed the paperwork, working with kids who need extra help with reading and writing. The director said they're desperate for someone with your experience. Stanley looked up, eyes bright with surprise and something else. Hope, maybe. "You think I still have something to offer?" "I know you do," Andre said firmly. By September, both Stanley and Andre had settled into new routines. Stanley's tutoring sessions quickly became the highlight of his week. The energy of working with struggling students seemed to reverse the clock for him, bringing color to his cheeks and a spring to his step that had been missing for years. Andre excelled in school, particularly in English literature, a fact that filled Stanley with unmistakable pride. "Takes after his guardian," he would tell anyone who would listen. The day of the final guardianship hearing arrived with perfect fall weather, crisp, clear, and full of possibility. Andre wore a tie that had belonged to Stanley's son, carefully knotted according to Stanley's instructions. Elaine met them at the courthouse, her professional demeanor in her suit not quite hiding her emotion. The judge reviewed their case thoroughly, asking Andre several questions about his wishes and well-being. When she finally declared Stanley his legal guardian, the old man's eyes filled with tears. "Never thought I'd have a second chance at this," he whispered to Andre as they signed the final paperwork. At family. That evening, they celebrated with a special dinner at home, Andre cooking with Elaine helping and Stanley supervising from his seat at the kitchen table. The house was filled with the kind of comfortable chatter that only happens when people have grown to know and love each other's quirks and habits. After dinner, Stanley raised his glass in a toast. "To second chances," he said. "And to snowy nights that change our paths forever." Later, as Andre helped Stanley up the stairs to bed, something that had become less necessary as the old man's health improved, but remained their nightly ritual, Stanley paused at the top. "Landing, you know," he said thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that night we met. Most people would say you were the one who got saved. From the cold, from the streets." He shook his head slowly. "But I think we both know who really rescued who." Andre smiled, thinking of all the empty, purposeless days that had stretched before Stanley before that snowy night, and all the cold, hungry ones that had loomed before him. "Maybe," he said. "We saved each other." 5 years later, Andre stood at a podium in his graduation cap and gown, delivering the valedictorian address to his high school class. In the audience, Stanley sat straight and proud, now walking with just a slight limp rather than a cane. Beside him was Elaine, who had moved back to town the previous year to be closer to what she now called "my 2 favorite men." Life can change in a single moment, Andre told his classmates and the assembled families. One decision to help instead of walk away, one choice to trust instead of fear, one step toward someone else instead of away. His eyes found Stanley's in the crowd. "We all have the power to change a life," he continued. "Sometimes, if we're very lucky, the life we change the most turns out to be our own."